The Syrian government says more than 30 people have been killed in 2 suicide car bombings outside security service buildings in the capital, Damascus. State television reported that booby-trapped cars blew up at 2 facilities on Friday, killing civilians and soldiers. It showed footage of plumes of smoke, wrecked buildings, mangled body parts and ambulances taking the injured away. It is one of the worst cases of violence to hit Syria's capital during 9 months of unrest against President Bashar al-Assad. State media said initial inquiries suggested that the militant network Al-Qaeda was behind the attacks. But opposition figures say the blasts were staged by the government to bolster claims that it is fighting a militant uprising. Reports that the bombings were directed against Russian intelligence have not been confirmed. The Russian embassy in Syria described the claims as utter nonsense, according to the state-owned news agency RIA Novosti. Syria says it is battling a campaign by foreign-backed gunmen and terrorists. This week, it said more than 2,000 members of the army and security forces have been killed since March. The United Nations, however, says Assad's forces have killed more than 5,000 people in their crackdown and may have committed crimes against humanity. Anti-Assad protests erupted in March, inspired by uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt and Libya, and have swept the Middle Eastern country. But central Damascus and the northern commercial city of Aleppo have remained relatively calm. In recent months, what had been a mainly peaceful pro-democracy movement has become overshadowed by pockets of armed insurgency that have attacked Syrian security forces. Friday's attacks came a day after the arrival of Arab League officials to prepare for a monitoring team that will check whether Assad is fulfilling a plan to end the bloodshed. The peace plan calls for a withdrawal of troops from the streets of protest-hit citizen towns, the release of prisoners and dialogue with the opposition. The main group of around 150 observers is to arrive by the end of December. Activists say Assad is still trying to stamp out protests with troops and tanks despite sanctions and his avowed agreement to the Arab League plan. To discuss Friday's car bombs, I'm joined by Nyresa Cama, a Middle East analyst for the Risk Advisory Group. Nyresa, can we come to any conclusion yet about Friday's reported attacks?
The thing is, it's very, very difficult to actually know what exactly has happened. All that we have is a government account of 2 suicide bombings. The opposition very much seems to feel that this has been staged by the government to kind of prove, in inverted commas, that the uprising, that the protest movement has a militant element to it. Syrian government officials have actually come out and said, we've said from the beginning that this uprising was motivated by militant groups, and this just proves that fact. There is no one's word to take on this but the government. So it's very difficult to really say if it does open up a new chapter because we don't know if what's happened is genuine.
One of the claims is that it was Al-Qaeda. From a Middle East expert's point of view, is that even plausible?
Again, it's difficult to say. There is not sort of a real history of Al-Qaeda conducting attacks in Syria. If this was Al-Qaeda, this would certainly be Al-Qaeda's most significant attack inside Syria. Again, difficult to say if it really is Al-Qaeda. We only have the government's word to go by. It's interesting, there are accounts from Damascus where activists and residents in the areas where this happened have said they heard these explosions, they saw smoke rising, but the sort of security guards around these government facilities where the bomb blast took place just continued sitting there, sort of sipping tea, literally. They didn't bat an eyelid, which is quite a sort of odd reaction. So again, it's very difficult to really know what's happened.
You mentioned the Arab League observers, some of whom have just turned up in Syria over the last couple of days. Can you give us an idea of what they're going to be doing in Syria?
Yeah, so the first group, sort of an advanced party of Arab League observers, arrived in Syria yesterday. Now, if all goes to plan, there will be about 15 groups who will arrive by the end of the month. Essentially, what they're there to do is to see if Syria is fulfilling the terms of an agreement that it's entered into with the Arab League to clear soldiers and weaponry out of towns and cities, to release political prisoners. They're meant to have freedom of movement, so they're meant to be able to go unannounced anywhere they want to go. Now, the opposition has expressed sort of considerable doubt that this will actually happen, so we're going to have to sort of wait and see what these observer groups are actually allowed to do.
And they're there at a time where mass protests seem to be continuing, as far as the footage that we're getting from different cities across Syria seems to indicate, and a new death toll figure of more than 6,000. From your opinion, is Syria descending into an out-and-out civil war?
I think it's certainly fair to say that the Syrian uprising is coming closer and closer to civil war. I mean, these sort of defections from the army certainly suggest that there definitely seems to be sort of an armed element to what's happening. So yes, I think it's fair to say that Syria is sort of descending towards civil war. And what's quite interesting is that the sort of upper echelons of the army and of the regime remain loyal to the Assad government, but there are sort of increasing accounts that suggest that the rank and file of the army is beginning to defect in ever greater numbers. So that is definitely troubling from the government's perspective.
You mentioned the army defectors. We've heard calls from them for international action through the UN Security Council, and I've even heard calls from one defector for a no-fly zone over Syria, like the one that was imposed on Libya. How realistic is any of this?
I don't think the international community at this point in time has a major appetite to intervene in Syria. I think that what we're seeing quite clearly through the sanctions programs that are being put in place is that both regionally and internationally, the Arab League, Turkey, the EU are trying to squeeze Syria economically, and they're trying to kind of go down an economic route and sort of get these groups within the country. There's this sort of urban and merchant elite in Damascus and Aleppo and sort of the upper echelons of the regime to sort of abandon Assad, and they're trying to do it economically. I don't think at this point that we've come to a stage where we're really seeing that there's going to be a no-fly zone put in place or anything like that.
That was Nyresa Cama, a Middle East analyst for the Risk Advisory Group, a private firm which makes security assessments. A British-based human rights group has reported that Assad's forces carried out major assaults in the northern and southern provinces this week. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says that the government is trying to crush opponents and strengthen its hand ahead of Arab League monitoring. It says troops surrounded and killed 111 people on Tuesday in the northern province of Idlib, the deadliest such attack since the uprising erupted. To discuss this, I'm joined by Mousab Azzawi, who coordinates the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Mousab, do you see Friday's blasts as a worrying development?
Well, it's a worrying development if we believe in that, and because we work only by facts, and we received a statement from eyewitness, and it has been endorsed by two of our members, and they live just not more than 300 meters off that building. They reported that they did not see any black smoke, they saw just white smoke coming out of the building, and then the attendants were doing their job as usual. After 3 minutes they hit a few bullets in the air and some noise of shooting, and after that 3 fire brigades cars came, 3 ambulances just turned around the building and left away. So we don't believe that this is a real event. We feel that it's staged or maybe fake.
What will be the reasons for doing this? One of the claims is that it is being stage managed by the government to influence the Arab League observers who turned up in Syria over the last couple of days.
Well, basically, too many reasons. The Syrian regime is trying just to distract the attention of the whole international community, which is concerned about what's going on in Syria. Regardless, the approach, there are some kind of differences in the approaches. But basically, they're trying to say that we are the barrier against Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is not existed in Syria. We do know that the Syrian regime is supporting other fundamentalist groups, but we did not hear that fundamentalism is a part of this revolution. According to what we hear, there are other accounts saying that there is, but according to what we hear from our 240 reporters and affiliates and members on the ground, we don't believe this is something credible.
Is your organisation working with the Arab League group that have turned up in Syria over the last couple of days? And in what way will you be assisting them or advising them?
Well, basically, we wrote to them, but we did not receive an invitation to participate with them. And we raised our concern that this initiative is too short. from being able to achieve any result. Reason being, because if you remember what happened in Kosovo, they sent more than 5,000 observers in the first batch, and in the second batch they sent more than 2,000 observers, totaling 7,000. And that was in a smaller size than Syria, but in Syria they're sending 150 over the course of 21 days or 2 weeks. But this is too short from covering the 1,200 villages and towns and flashpoints and detention centers. So we think that this is technically difficult to achieve any result. With regards to the civil war, yes, indeed, the country is on the brink of civil war, and we would like to blame the international community from taking very strict measures to pressurize the regime to implement reforms and accept to withdraw all the military aspects from the streets and release the detainees and start to accept that there is a crisis. It's immoral to say that there are armed gangs trying to topple the regime. There are just simple people who want freedom and dignity, which is very normal, and something should happen. So if the international community is so late, we will be in a civil war, and the civil war will not be limited to the boundaries of Syria and may spread very quickly to the neighboring countries.